The chamber had no windows. That was the first thing Lena Okafor noticed when the doors sealed behind them. No windows, no visible vents, no way to tell whether it was morning or midnight, or something else entirely on whatever clock this station ran by. Just light, cold, even soulless, falling on 47 delegation tables arranged in a descending arc, like teeth closing around a single point at the bottom, where the human table sat. Lena set her documents down carefully and did not look at the other delegations yet. She could feel them, though. 47 species, hundreds of representatives, and the collective attention of all of them pressing down on the two humans at the lowest tier like a thumb on a bug. Ambassador Sarah Voss sat beside her and poured herself a glass of water. That was it. That was the full extent of her arrival ceremony. She poured water, set the pitcher down, and looked up at the chamber with the mild, patient expression of someone waiting for a delayed train. Lena had worked with Voss for 6 years. She still could not read her. The session opened with procedural announcements. Translation feeds activated. Recording protocols confirmed. Mreth Kal of the Vrethian delegation, lead architect of what the council was calling the Comprehensive Alignment Framework, and what Lena's briefing notes quietly called the Subordination Treaty, rose to address the chamber. He was tall. All Vrethians were tall, but Mreth Kal wore his height the way certain people wore expensive clothes, as a reminder, not a fact. His translator rendered his words in smooth, almost warm standard, the voice of someone who had spent a long time learning how to sound like he was doing you a favor. This session, he began, represents the culmination of 4 decades of dialogue. Of the Council's sustained commitment to integrating all worlds, all peoples, into the shared architecture of galactic civilization. Lena wrote, 4 decades of dialogue. She underlined it. What 4 decades of dialogue had actually looked like? 17 rounds of trade renegotiations, in which Earth's export quotas were reduced each time. 3 territorial compacts that had moved the boundary of human-monitored space inward by a combined margin of 40 light-years. 2 demographic accords that required Earth to submit population and resource projections for Council review on an annual basis, projections the Council could formally object to, though what that objection triggered exactly had always been left vague. What it had looked like on Earth's side, compliance, signatures, delegations that showed up, listened, raised small procedural questions, and eventually signed. The other species had a word for it, Lena knew. It translated roughly as managed, as in humanity had been managed, guided carefully over 40 years, into a position where today's session was not really a negotiation at all. It was a formality. Earth would sign the Comprehensive Alignment Framework, which would formally classify humanity as a Tier 3 associate world, which would make Council oversight of Earth's resources, territorial claims, and population decisions a matter of permanent galactic law. It would be, Mreth Kal had told a closed Council session 2 weeks ago. Lena had the transcript. The quiet conclusion of a long and necessary process. Mreth Kal was still speaking. He had excellent posture. Voss drank her water. Lena looked at the exits, 2 of them, both sealed by Council security protocol for the duration of a formal session. She looked at the seating tier. The human table was 3 steps below the next closest delegation. She had assumed that was just geometry. Now she looked at it and wondered when that decision had been made, and who had made it, and why neither she nor anyone at the Foreign Ministry had flagged it. She wrote, tier placement, check original chamber specs. Mreth Kal moved through his address with the confidence of a man narrating a foregone conclusion. The framework's provisions, its benefits, the stability it would bring, the protections it would extend to Earth. Protections, he said, that were only available to worlds operating under Council guidance. Lena noticed around the 20-minute mark that his language had shifted, not dramatically, just a few degrees. He had stopped saying alignment and started saying transition. He had stopped saying partnership and started saying governance structure. Small words, the kind of words that meant something very specific in treaty law. She wrote them down. Voss did not write anything. She sat with her hands folded loosely on the table, and listened in the way that Lena had come to recognize. Not passive, not drifting, but the way a person listens when they have already heard everything being said, and are simply waiting for the other person to finish. At the 30-minute mark, Mrethkal concluded. He thanked the council for their sustained commitment. He thanked the human delegation for their long-demonstrated spirit of cooperation. The phrasing had the texture of a eulogy. "We invite Ambassador Voss," he said, settling back into his seat with the ease of a man who has already won, to confirm Earth's acceptance of the framework and to proceed with formal ratification. The chamber was quiet. 47 delegations, hundreds of faces, in every configuration biology had managed to produce, all of them looking at the lowest table. Voss set down her water glass. "Thank you, Delegate Mrethkal," she said. Her voice carried without effort. It was not a loud voice. It was the kind of voice that rooms obeyed without being asked. That was a thorough address. I want to say sincerely that the Council's effort over these decades has been remarkable. The framework itself is an impressive document. A pause. Not a dramatic one, just a breath. "Before we proceed to ratification," she said, "I wonder if I might ask one administrative question, a small matter of procedural clarity." "It won't take long." Mrethkal's expression did not change. "Of course, Ambassador." "Thank you," Voss said. She did not ask the question. She poured herself more water instead, settled back in her chair, and looked up at the chamber with that same mild, patient expression, like the question was already in the room and simply hadn't been spoken yet, and she saw no reason to rush. Lena looked at her notepad, looked at Voss, looked at the sealed doors. Something in the chamber's recycled air felt different now. Not the temperature, not the sound, something structural, like a weight had shifted somewhere in the walls, and nothing visible had moved, but the building itself knew. High Arbiter Jorvan, ancient and gray and seated at the apex of the chamber's arc, looked down at the human table with eyes that had watched 1,000 negotiations conclude. He looked, Lena thought, like a man who had just heard something he could not identify. Not a word, not a threat, an administrative question that had not yet been asked. The session lights held steady, the translator feeds hummed. Mrethkal waited, pleasantly, for a formality to complete itself. Voss folded her hands. She could wait longer than anyone in this room had been alive. Year 7. The Communication Infrastructure Accord was 312 pages long. No delegation read all of it. The Vrethians read the territorial clauses. The Hisari read the trade provisions. The Collective of Ormath read the taxation framework. Everyone read the parts that mattered to them. The humans wrote the subnet protocols. 41 pages, buried in Appendix D. Dry technical language about data routing, signal priority, and network architecture. Nobody read Appendix D. It described plumbing. Plumbing was boring. Every species adopted the subnet protocols within 6 years, because they were efficient, well-designed, and freely available. Within a decade, galactic communications infrastructure ran on human-authored architecture, not because Earth had demanded it, because it worked, and the alternative was building something from scratch, and nobody wanted to do that. The maintenance contracts naturally went to the people who understood the system best. The session resumed after a brief procedural recess, 20 minutes called by Jorvan with no explanation. When the delegations returned, Voss was already in her seat. Lena suspected she had never left it. Mrethkal cleared his throat. "Ambassador, you mentioned an administrative question. The Council is ready to hear it before we proceed." "Of course," Voss said. "I'll get to it shortly. I just want to make sure the record is accurate on a few contextual points first, for completeness." Mrethkal smiled. "By all means." Year 14. The Medical Exchange Treaty was a humanitarian achievement. Earth's pharmaceutical research, shared freely with 14 species who lacked the biological database to develop comparable treatments. Several plagues ended, several more were prevented. The Council praised Earth's generosity at the signing ceremony. 3 different delegates used the word selfless. Buried in Appendix G, 40 pages of licensing and derivative research protocols. A single clause established Earth's authority over all compounds developed using human biological data as a base template. Not ownership, not a tax. Earth could formally certify whether a compound qualified for galactic medical distribution. Nobody objected to it. It read like paperwork. It took 12 years for the first major species to develop a pharmaceutical line that required human certification under Appendix G. It took another 4 for them to realize that certification was not automatic, was not free, and was not governed by any law except the one Earth had authored. There was no malice in it. Earth certified everything that met safety standards. The fees were modest. But Earth decided what the standards were. Lena kept her pen moving. She was not writing notes anymore. She was writing to keep her hands from shaking. She had read the framework briefings. She had read the historical summaries. She had worked in the foreign ministry for 6 years. And she was sitting in this chamber right now, watching Voss hold the floor on the thinnest procedural thread imaginable. I have a question. I will ask it shortly. And only now, in this room, with the session documents open in front of her, and 40 years of history suddenly rearranging itself in her mind, did she begin to understand the shape of what she was looking at. Voss was talking about year 14. Calmly, clinically, for the record. Year 23. The Freight Arbitration Council was the least glamorous body in the galactic political structure. It handled disputes about shipping routes, cargo classification, tariff calculations, and transit documentation. Experienced diplomats avoided it the way experienced lawyers avoided tax court. Technically important, universally dreaded. Earth joined in year 23 and immediately volunteered for administrative duties. No other species objected. No other species wanted the paperwork. By year 28, Earth held the permanent chair. Not because they'd maneuvered for it, because they kept showing up, kept handling the filings, kept maintaining the databases, and eventually there was simply no institutional knowledge of freight arbitration that did not live inside the human delegation's office. The chair position came with something small. The right to issue provisional transit classifications during disputed cases. Classifications that remained in effect until formally overturned, which required a full council vote, which took on average 14 months. 14 months during which the classifications stood. 14 months during which whoever held the chair decided what moved where. Rethkal's smile had not moved, but something behind his eyes had. Lena watched him watching Voss, and saw a man doing rapid calculations about things he had previously considered settled. Jorvan, at the apex of the chamber, had gone very still. The stillness of someone who has identified a pattern and is now waiting to see how large it is. Voss did not hurry. Year 31. The voluntary military limitation was Earth's idea. A gesture of good faith, the human delegation said. A signal of commitment to peaceful integration. The council was delighted. Rethkal himself had drafted the congratulatory statement. Earth would limit its military tonnage to a fixed ceiling. The ceiling was calculated by hull weight classification standards authored by, it was almost elegant, Lena thought, the Freight Arbitration Council, currently chaired by Earth. The classification system sorted vessels into categories based on listed criteria. Drive type, hull composition, cargo capacity, crew complement. It did not account for a vessel class Earth had been quietly developing for 9 years. A class that met none of the listed criteria, and therefore was not, technically, a vessel under the classification system's own definitions. Earth's military tonnage, measured by the treaty's own metrics, was exactly at the ceiling. Everything else was something else entirely. I want to thank the Council for its patience with this contextual summary, Voss said, folding her hands on the table. I've tried to be thorough. Rethkal's voice, when it came, had lost about 15% of its warmth. Ambassador. The administrative question. Yes, Voss said. Of course. She reached into her folder. She placed it face down on the table. Did not look at it. Before I ask it, she said, I want to confirm something for the record. High Arbiter Jorvan. She looked up the tiers. The Council's foundational compact. The document signed at this body's formation. The one that defines membership classifications, voting rights, and treaty authority. That document is still in full legal effect, correct? Jorvan looked at her, a long moment. The kind of moment that had no procedure for itself. It is, he said. Thank you, Voss said. She left the page face down. She smiled the way a person smiles when they are not happy, exactly, but when they are completely at peace with what is about to happen. Rethkal, Lena noticed, had stopped smiling entirely. Rethkal moved to close the session at the 2-hour mark. It was a smooth move. Procedurally clean. He cited Article 14 of the Council's Session Governance Rules, time allocation for formal ratification proceedings, and proposed that given the thorough contextual record now established, the delegation proceed immediately to the signing protocol. Voss looked up from the table. I'm sorry, she said. I haven't asked my question yet. Ambassador. A thin quality entering his voice now like wire pulled tight. The Council has extended considerable courtesy. The question. Council Rule 7, Section 3, Voss said. Not loudly, not triumphantly, the way a person reads an address off an envelope. A recognized delegate retains floor rights until a formal question raised for the record has been answered. I raised a question for the record. It hasn't been answered. She paused. Or asked, technically. I haven't asked it yet. The chamber was quiet. Rethkal sat down. Lena wrote nothing. Her pen was against the paper and she was not writing. She was listening to the silence, the way you listen to a silence that has a shape to it. Not empty, not waiting, but occupied by something that hadn't announced itself yet. Jorvan said nothing. He watched. The second attempt came 40 minutes later. Rethkal, more carefully this time, invoked a different rule. Article 22, the provision allowing a session chair to call a procedural recess by majority delegate vote when proceedings had deviated materially from stated agenda. He called for the vote. 31 delegations raised their indicators, enough for a majority. Voss let the count complete. Then, Council Procedural Code, Volume 3, Section 9, Clause 14. A majority recess vote may not supersede active floor rights held under Rule 7, Section 3, unless the delegate holding floor rights formally waives them or the session chair certifies that the floor right has been improperly invoked. She looked at Jorvan. Would you like to certify that my floor right has been improperly invoked? Jorvan studied her. On what grounds would I do that? That's what I was wondering, Voss said. The vote died where it stood. Lena had stopped pretending to take notes. She was watching Voss the way you watch someone diffuse something, breath held, hand still, afraid that any movement might change the outcome. 6 years. She had carried briefing folders for 6 years, had sat in dozens of sessions in 4 different star systems, had watched Voss conduct negotiations over mining rights and transit corridors and biological exchange protocols, and she had always thought, had always quietly assumed, that Voss was good at this job. Careful, methodical, thorough. She was revising that assessment now. What she had mistaken for thoroughness was preparation of a different order entirely. Not the preparation of someone who was ready for this session. The preparation of someone who had built this session, plank by plank, rule by rule, over a span of time that started before Lena was old enough to read. The procedural rules Voss was citing, she hadn't looked them up. She hadn't referenced notes. They came from her mouth the way addresses come from someone describing their own house. Volume and section and clause, without pause, which meant she had known she would need them, which meant she had planned to be here, in this specific corner of the rules, and had simply waited for Mrethkal to back her into it. Except Mrethkal hadn't backed her into anything. She had walked here herself, and locked the door behind her. The third attempt was the most elegant. Mrethkal requested a private consultation between himself, Ambassador Voss, and the High Arbiter. Off the record, informal, just to discuss the path forward productively, he said. Voss said, "I appreciate the offer. I'll have to decline." She looked almost apologetic. Council Transparency Protocol. Ratified in Year 11. All proceedings between a delegate holding active floor rights and the session chair must occur in open session during formal proceedings. Anything else would create a record conflict. She could have added, Year 11, when the Transparency Protocol was proposed by... Actually, never mind. She didn't add it. She didn't need to. Mrethkal looked at her for a long moment. A look that had gone past frustration into something else. Something that was working very hard to find a foothold, and not finding one. "Ambassador Voss," he said finally, with the careful neutrality of a man choosing each word like a step on uncertain ice. "You have been recognized for a question. Please, ask it." "Of course," Voss said. She placed her hand on the page on the table, still face down. "I want to ask it cleanly," she said, "so I need to establish one more piece of record first." She looked up. "The Foundational Compact. The High Arbiter has confirmed it remains in effect. I want to confirm also that all treaties signed under its authority derive their legal standing from it. That a treaty cannot supersede it. That the Compact is, in the Council's own legal structure, the highest governing document." A pause. "This is not contested," Jorvan said slowly. "It is foundational law." "Yes," Voss said. "That's why it's called the Foundational Compact." The smallest silence. "Thank you," she said. Lena looked at the page on the table. Face down. One sheet. Whatever was written on it had been written a long time ago, and had been sitting in a folder, and before that, in a filing system, and before that, in a legal team's drafting room. And all of it, all 40 years of subnet protocols, and pharmaceutical clauses, and freight classification tables, had been pointing at this one page, in the way that rivers point at the sea. She thought about what Voss had said 2 days ago, when Lena had asked how she was feeling about the session. "Fine," Voss had said. "It's mostly administrative, at this point." Lena had thought she meant the signing. She had not meant the signing. Mrethkal sat with his hands flat on his table. His translator earpiece was working. His staff were leaning toward him, whispering. He was not listening to them. He was watching the human ambassador with the focused, absolute attention of a person who has just realized that the thing they were holding was not what they thought it was, and they are not sure yet when they picked it up. Voss turned the page over. She looked at it for one moment. Then she looked up at the chamber. All of it, all 47 delegations, all the centuries of accumulated galactic order seated in their tiers, with the same mild expression she had worn since she walked in. Unhurried, untroubled, the expression of someone who had already arrived at a destination, and was simply waiting for everyone else to catch up. "My question," she said, "is actually a notification." She began to speak. She did not stand. Standing was for speeches. This was not a speech. She stayed seated, both hands resting on the table, the page in front of her, and when she spoke, it was in the same even, unhurried voice she had used to thank the arbitration staff for the water, and to ask Lena to double-check the document timestamps that morning. A voice for routine things. "The Earth delegation formally notifies this council," she said, "that pursuant to Article 3, Clause 9 of the Foundational Compact, Earth is exercising its right to reclassify its membership status from Associate World to Foundational Seat, effective as of this session's record date." The chamber did not react. Not because nothing had happened, because nothing had processed yet. She continued. "As the primary architect and majority operator of Council communications infrastructure under the Year 7 Accord, as the classification authority for galactic pharmaceutical distribution under the Year 14 Treaty's Appendix G, and as the permanent chair of the Freight Arbitration Council, Earth meets the three-pillar threshold defined in Article 3 for foundational seat eligibility. A pause. Not for effect. Just breath. This threshold has been met for the last 9 years. Earth chose to file at this session. Still nothing. The silence in the chamber was not the silence of an empty room. It was the silence of a room full of people whose minds were running very fast and not yet arriving anywhere. Voss reached the last part. Under the Compact's own provisions, foundational seat status retroactively reclassifies all treaties signed during Associate World status. Those treaties are not void. They are subject to mandatory renegotiation under foundational seat terms within 18 months of reclassification. She looked up. That includes the Comprehensive Alignment Framework currently before this session, which cannot be ratified, as it was drafted under an Associate World classification that no longer exists. She simply became aware, several seconds later, that she had not drawn air since Voss said, "foundational seat." And she made herself inhale now, carefully, like someone testing ice. Mreth Cal stood. His chair pushed back. He stood at his table, at the middle tier, and he opened his mouth, and nothing came out. Not because he had nothing to say, because there was no procedure for what had just happened, and he had spent 40 years inside procedure, and outside it, he did not have a language. He sat back down. A delegate from the Hasari block, young, fast, analytical, leaned over her console. Lena could see her pulling up documents. The Compact, the Year 7 Accord, Appendix G, Freight Arbitration Founding Charter. Running the references like a person pulling at a thread and watching the fabric move. She made a sound. It was not a word. The translator rendered it as a tone. Something between recognition and the specific dread of a person who has just found the thing they were afraid to find. She sat back, said nothing, looked at the ceiling. At the apex of the chamber, High Arbiter Jorvan read the page. He had received a copy through the session's document feed. He read it the way old legal minds read things, slowly, returning to specific clauses, not scanning, but parsing. His face showed nothing. He had spent a very long time learning to show nothing. But his hands, Lena noticed. His hands on the edge of his console, white at the knuckles. The Compact's Article 3, Clause 9, was not an obscure provision. It had been included at the Council's founding as a theoretical mechanism, a way for a world that had become genuinely integral to the Galactic Order to receive recognition commensurate with its actual role, rather than its historical classification. It had been written, the original draft, by a legal team working on the Compact's framework in the Council's first year. That team had included 2 human legal scholars, invited as advisors. Invited, specifically, because the drafting committee needed people who were good with language. The clause's current wording, the wording that defined the 3-pillar threshold, the exact criteria, the reclassification mechanism, had been amended in Year 4, during a routine Compact maintenance session that no senior delegate had attended because it was considered administrative cleanup. The amendment had been proposed by the Earth delegation. It had passed without discussion. Nobody had read it carefully. Nobody had needed to, yet. Mreth Cal found his voice. It was a smaller voice than the one he had arrived with. This, what you have done, this is not what that clause was designed for. The intent of Article 3 was never. The Compact doesn't govern intent, Voss said. It governs language. You cannot simply, the threshold is met, the filing is in order. The Compact's own legal framework provides the mechanism. A pause. Still that same voice. Still that same expression. If there is a procedural objection, the High Arbiter can rule on it. Every head in the chamber turned to Jorvan. Jorvan looked at the page, looked at Voss, looked at the page again. He was, Lena understood, looking for the error. The place where Voss had overreached or miscited or stretched the language, past what it could hold. His hands stayed white at the knuckles. He found nothing. Because there was nothing to find. The filing, Jorvan said, and his voice was the most careful thing Lena had ever heard, appears to be in order. The chamber erupted. Not in shouting, in the particular chaos of dozens of translation feeds carrying dozens of conversations at once. A wall of sound that the translator rendered as overlapping fragments, none of them coherent, all of them urgent. Rethkal's staff surrounded him. The Hesari delegate was transmitting something. 3 delegations from the outer systems were conferring in tight clusters. A junior aide from somewhere in the mid-tier was already drafting what looked like an emergency motion. In the middle of it, Voss picked up her water glass, drank, set it down, refilled it. The session now had no procedure. It had no procedure because she had written every procedure in this room, and had left this particular one out, on purpose, with full knowledge of what the absence would mean in a session she had been preparing to hold since before Lena Okafor was born. Lena looked at her. Voss looked at the chamber. 47 species recalculating everything. The comprehensive alignment framework, the document that would have made Earth a managed world forever, was not going to be signed today. It was not going to be signed ever, under those terms, by a delegation that no longer held the classification those terms required. Everything was going to be renegotiated, under different terms, human terms. The water in Voss's glass was perfectly still. The session did not formally close. There was no procedure to close it. The agenda had assumed a signing, and the signing was not happening. And without the agenda, the session chair had no mechanism to end the record. So the record simply kept running. 47 delegations talking at each other while the official timestamp climbed, and nobody moved to stop it. Voss stood up. She gathered her one page, placed it back in her folder, and picked up her water glass, then set it down again, because it belonged to the session room, and she had no use for it outside. Small decision. 2 seconds. Then she looked at Lena, and tilted her head toward the door. They walked out. No security escort. No fanfare. The council's door protocol was suspended, because the session hadn't closed, and the door system didn't know what to do. So it simply opened when Voss pressed the panel, and they walked through. And behind them, 47 species continued dismantling and reconstructing their understanding of galactic law. The corridor was empty and very long. Their footsteps were the only sound. Lena made it about 30 meters. How long? She said. Not a question exactly, more like a word falling out of her. The clause was written before you were born, Voss said. Before Lena stopped walking. The Year 4 amendment. A legal team filed it during a compact maintenance session. No senior delegates present. Routine cleanup. Voss kept walking. Lena caught up. Nobody reads maintenance sessions. You read them. We wrote them. Lena processed that for several steps. The corridor curved slightly ahead, the station's slow geometry bending the light. The subnet protocols, the pharmaceutical clause, the freight chair. All of it was infrastructure, Voss said. Real infrastructure. The protocols worked. The pharmaceutical standards were good standards. The freight arbitration was competently run. None of it was built as a trick. It was built to be useful. And it was useful. And it happened to also constitute the 3-pillar threshold. Those aren't different things. But you knew. We knew what we were building. Lena let that sit. The corridor hummed around them, station systems running their quiet cycles, indifferent to the legal earthquake 300 meters behind. Rethkal's going to challenge it, Lena said. He'll try. The compact's language is the compact's language, Voss said. He can challenge the filing, he can request a legal review, he can propose an emergency amendment. All of those processes will take time, and during that time Earth's reclassification stands, and during that time the framework cannot be ratified, and during that time 18 months of mandatory renegotiation will begin. A beat. We have people who are very good at renegotiation. Of course we do. They've been practicing for 40 years. They reached the junction corridor. the point where the session wing met the main transit hub. Voss stopped. Zorvan was there. Alone. No aides, no security. Just the old arbiter in his formal robes. Standing in the middle of the corridor, with his hands at his sides, looking at Voss the way a person looks at something they have been trying to understand for a long time, and have only just found the right angle on. Lena took a half step back. She did not mean to. Her feet did it without her. Zorvan looked at Voss for a long moment. Then he said, "How long have you known this moment would happen?" "Since I was appointed to the delegation," Voss said. "I inherited the plan. I didn't build it from the start." "Who built it?" "People who are dead now. They were patient people." Zorvan absorbed that. His face was very controlled, but there was something moving underneath it. Not anger, not admiration exactly. The expression of a master player studying a game he has just lost, and trying to understand how he did not see it. "You spent 40 years in compliance, signing things, accepting limitations." He paused. "All of it building toward this. All of it being genuinely useful to the Council," Voss said. "That's not in conflict." A silence. "Was there ever a version," Zorvan said, "where you lose?" Voss looked at him. A real look, not the careful diplomatic surface, but something behind it, considering the question with genuine weight. "We already lost once," she said, "a long time ago, before the Council existed even. We lost badly." Something settled in her expression, not grief, not pride, the particular quiet of a wound that has been carrying itself for long enough that it no longer announces its presence. "That's where I got the idea." Zorvan was still. He looked at her the way you look at a thing when you have suddenly understood it, and understanding it has not made it smaller. Then he nodded once. He walked past them, back toward the session wing, and did not look back. Lena watched him go. "What did you mean," she said, "that you already lost?" Voss started walking again. Lena fell into step beside her. "There was a period," Voss said, "early, before Earth had any standing in any galactic body. We were invited to the first council sessions as observers. No vote, no voice. We watched how it worked." She paused. "We watched how it worked very carefully." "What happened?" "We were reclassified as a developing world and removed from observer status. Told we weren't ready. That in a generation or two, after appropriate integration, Earth might be considered for associate standing." Lena thought about that. "How long ago?" 60 years. Lena did the math against the timeline she now had in her head. The Year 7 protocols, Year 14 pharmaceutical clause, Year 23 freight chair, Year 31 military classification. All of it post-removal. All of it built by a species that had been told to wait in the hallway, and had said, quietly and without argument, "Of course, thank you, we'll wait," and then gone home and built a hallway of their own. "The people who started this," Lena said, "they knew they'd never see it finished." "Yes, they built it anyway." "They built it because," Voss said, "knowing you won't see it is not the same as knowing it won't happen." They reached the embarkation corridor. Their transport back to Earth's orbital station was docked at the far end. A modest ship, mid-range, the kind that didn't attract attention. Voss had picked it herself. Behind them, through the station's walls and corridors, Lena could still hear it. Not clearly, not words, just the sound of it. The combined noise of 47 delegations in a chamber that had no procedure for its current situation. All of them talking at once. The galactic order doing the thing orders do when something fundamental shifts beneath them. It was a large sound. Lena stood at the entrance to the embarkation corridor and looked back at the closed door, at the curve of the corridor, at the empty space where Zorvan had been standing. She thought about 60 years of patience, about legal scholars who drafted clauses they would never invoke, about delegates who attended maintenance sessions that no one else considered worth attending, about a species that had been handed defeat and had looked at it carefully for a long time, and then asked a quiet question. What exactly did we lose? And what does that tell us about how to win? Ambassador, she said. Voss had already started down the embarkation corridor. She didn't stop. We have renegotiations to prepare for. Lena looked at the door one more time. Behind it, 47 species were recalculating everything. 40 years of managed agreements, slowly dismantling. 18 months of new terms, to be written by people who had been practicing for 40 years. She turned away from the door. She walked through. She did not look back, either.